welcome you to this web session for the Fabian Society on the EU Green Deal. How we would like to conduct it is Caroline Lambert, the EU Delegation Head of Trade, will give a presentation on the EU Green Deal. And then Julianne Genter will offer a comment on it. We'd like everybody to feed their questions into the chat. So we won't, we're planning not to have a sort of discussion through voice, but through the chat. And then once Julianne Genter's spoken, we'll feed the questions up that people have put into the chat. So now I'd like to ask Pat Webster to introduce Caroline Lambert, please, Pat, and I'll go off the screen.
Thank you, Mike. Kia ora tātou. I would like to introduce tonight our speaker, Caroline Lambert, who is the Head of Trade and Green Diplomacy with the European Union delegation in New Zealand. Caroline's got an extensive academic background in international economics, international relations, law, and European political science. And she's worked in the EU civil service since 2000 and was in the office for the EU Commission for Climate Action. More recently, Caroline was the EU Climate and Environmental Councillor in Australia before her present role in New Zealand, where she leads climate, energy, and other Green Deal aspects of diplomacy. In 2015, 195 countries signed the Paris Agreement. And in mid-July this year, the EU was the first party to table a comprehensive set of legislation to undertake, to make good this commitment, to make a credible near-rosette pathway. They're aiming for an interim reduction of emissions by 55% by 2030. The EU is seeking to lead and inspire. And if they are successful, the impact will go beyond EU borders. So it will leave no sector of the EU economy untouched, and it will affect the trade flows, financial flows, production and consumption patterns throughout the world. So with this in mind, I'd like to introduce Caroline to give us an overview and a better understanding about just what this deal that they're trying to concretize looks like. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you very much, Mike. Kia ora tātou. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. And I will now share my screen. And hopefully I can also decide to use the slideshow function. I can't access the button because of this. Voilà. Yes, all good?
Yes.
Very good. So I start by saying a few words about who the European Union is. We're the largest, the longest, and the deepest experience of peaceful economic and political integration. We now have 27 member states. They have decided to share sovereignty on a number of issues. We also have 450 million people living in peace for 70 years on a continent that had been ravaged by wars for millennia. But the next frontier for us, really, post-Brexit, is our determination as part of the European Green Deal to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. It is a high political stakes exercise. First, for our leadership, because our leadership has made it its priority, but it's also a test for the European project as a project for prosperity, for peace, and for solidarity, both inside the European Union and outside the European Union. And of course, it is a test of our capacity to tackle the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the inequality crisis, and build back better from the pandemic towards a greener, but also a fairer European Union. I'd like to say a few words of context before I go into our policy package. And the first contextualization is about the international scene and where we stand today, the European Union and New Zealand, with regard to what we promised to back in 2015 in Paris. And because my French accent may not be enough of a memory trigger for you, I'll play a short video about that day, the 12th of December.
It's nice sound.
I heard someone saying there was no sound, so I'll just translate what he said. That was in French. He just said the Paris Agreement is adopted. And it was a great moment, and what you could see there was emotion. The world had been working for over 20 years in agreeing a universal, legally binding agreement, and that was the day it happened. So what did we agree to, commit to in Paris? We committed to limit temperature rise to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. And both the European Union and New Zealand actually agree that the real goal is that 1.5 degree goal, because that is the goal that limits the impact on climate change on the most vulnerable worldwide, including in the Pacific. We also committed to a series of things, and this is just an extract here. We committed to make nationally determined contributions, what we tend to call NDCs. These are emissions reduction pledges that we have to upgrade every 5 years in line with science. And we also have to pursue domestic measures to deliver on these NDCs, on these targets, because otherwise it would be all talk and no walk. So where do we stand to, I didn't want to do that. Sorry, I'll stop that. Where we stand today is 6 years, in fact, after Paris. We are 1 year late because COVID kind of derailed everyone's plans last year. 6 years, nearly 6 years after Paris, it's the time to deliver. And on the 14th of July, the European Union, the European Commission, to be more precise, tabled its policy package to reach our next legal goalpost towards net zero. That is an increase of our NDC, a reduction of our emissions by 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. It is the most ambitious policy package ever tabled, and it is also, more sadly, the only upgraded NDC with detailed policy measures that has been tabled ahead of Glasgow. The science context, we had a recent upgrade of the science context 2 weeks ago by the IPCC. So I'll just summarize a bit what was said. There's 3 keywords there. It's unequivocal that climate change is happening and that it is human-made. It's unprecedented, that is, human beings were not on planet Earth last time it was that hot. And it's irreversible. We cannot go back to a climate that would seem familiar and safe. However, we can still avoid unmanageable type on climate change and the worst effects if we take urgent, ambitious action. Sorry, this suddenly became very big for some reason. I probably have to escape. No, it works. Urgent, ambitious action. And this is a time-bound existential imperative because we have very little time to keep things under control. And that's why the stock taking that will take place in Glasgow in November, the next COP, will be so important. It is the rendezvous for all of the parties of the Paris Agreement to look at each other in the eyes and say again that they are determined and that they are delivering, show that they are delivering. The Paris Agreement is the only multilateral tool that we have to tackle humanity's greatest threat, and we cannot undermine trust in that tool. So it is a very important meeting, and the European Union is very proud of being the first to table detailed policy measures, but we are expecting also high ambition, and we have expectations from our partners. What is the policy framing that science has given us for our NDCs? First, and I'll invite you to look at the right-hand side, is that it is the critical decade. We've got very little time to reduce our emissions and keep temperature rise to well below 1.5 degrees. It all depends as to what type of a risk person you are. If you are a risk taker and you're happy with 1 in 2 chances of staying below 1.5 degrees, then back in 2020, we had about 11 years of current emissions level. So we have about a decade from now on. If you are more risk adverse and you'd be happier with an 83% chance of staying well below 1.5 degrees, then today we have about 6 years left of emissions at current levels. That drives me to the left-hand side of the screen, where you have the type of emissions reduction curves that are compatible with a 1.5 degree world. Today, in 2021, the world still collectively emits around 40 billion tons CO2. That means that we are at the top of that curve, at that graph. If we are to stay well below 1.5 degrees, the type of emissions reduction slope that we need to be on is very drastic. In fact, it's the type of slope that only experienced skiers would adventure themselves on. The thing is, to benefit from a gentler slope, we would have had to start earlier. If we had started in the year 2000, as you can see, the slope would have been more gentle. But now what happens is that we are stuck with having to use unprecedented type of policy mixes to decrease emissions, because this is not steady incremental change. This is accelerated civilizational change. So we have to muster up the political courage to explain that to people and to design a policy package that is responding to the emergency. And that's what the European Union has done on the 14th of July. So to sum up, we need drastic emissions reductions, and that requires strong state intervention, because it's not something that businesses will do on their own, and unprecedented policy mixes. That also requires to have everyone on board. So I'll say a few words about the political scene setter in the European Union. We have, of course, scientists on board. We have also the financial sector on board. Actually, most of the banking sector, the financial services sector, they have first on their own after Paris, but also through the help of EU legislation after that, they've put net zero at the heart of their decision-making. Courts and justice are also fully on board. There's been recent rulings in several parts in the world and several in European member states, where some states have been scolded because their action was not strong enough and not in line with what is now deemed by several courts as a human rights imperative to reduce emissions quickly. The military and the defense have been telling us for over a decade now that climate action is a security imperative. The youth, of course, that will not surprise you, is ready for strong action. And the press is now more than before benchmarking policy proposals and political discourses against what science requires. Also, we've had that good polling results early July in the European Union, where over 90% of Europeans, had taken action, believed that climate change was a serious problem, and also agreed that we needed to go to net zero by 2050 in the European Union. that unanimous agreement is not necessarily there when we go down to actual policy measures. We don't have climate denial anymore in the European Union, or very, very little. But what we do have is fear and concerns about the type of policy mechanisms that are needed. So our business sector is divided. Of course, some see opportunities, others find reasons to be worried. And these worries may delay action, which we need to take into account in our policy rules. And the electorate is also divided. Most people are not all that interested into detailed policy mechanisms. Some are very mobilized, some are worried, and there's lots of concerns expressed. So we needed to make sure that to bring everyone on board in a transformational wave for the European Union, we needed to ensure that we answer to all concerns. So what are these concerns? And I have here used a graph that has been published recently in a very interesting research paper in global sustainability to categorize these concerns and to explain typically how we addressed these concerns in our policy paper. First type of concerns that you see on the left hand side of the screens in purple are from people who think it's basically too late to take strong climate action, and that on top of that, most people wouldn't agree to the type of policy measures that would be needed. That is called surrenderism. And it's not something that we're tackling specifically in our package, but because we believe that if the proof is in the pudding, in a sense, if we deliver, then it's clear that it is possible. Then at the top of the graph are the green type of arguments. But you hear also in New Zealand, all of these you hear in the EU and in New Zealand equally by different people. These type of concerns are the European Union only emits about 8% of the world's emissions today. And of course, for New Zealand, it's even less than that. So really, it's not for us to take action first. It would be for, I don't know, and then you can choose the US, China, Russia, whoever you want. You understand the type of argument. Other type of argument is, but if we take action ahead of everyone else, we are going to be disadvantaged. These type of arguments can be grouped under tragedy or the commons problem. That's indeed in a globalized world, those that go ahead take some risk and maybe in some cases disadvantaged. So our policy package is trying to protect our climate contribution and Europeans from that threat and from that concern. Yeah, and I'll explain why later. In red, you have the type of concerns expressed by businesses, but also by elected representatives saying, well, this actually could cost me as a business or as an elected politician, because some people will lose out, some will win, but some people will lose out. So it's a transition problem. And some of the answer is in the policy mix. We need to create opportunities. We need to help those sectors that have more trouble adapt. But some of the answers are also about the political and the business horizon of reference. Because transformational change is something that needs to take place along decades, and it doesn't necessarily fit with the mandate of a business towards its shareholders or a politician towards its electorate. And so we also have designed some tricks in our policy designs to ensure that people widen their horizon of reference. The concerns in blue at the bottom are concerns, genuine concerns related to the social impact of the climate policy measures to go towards net zero quickly. And it is true that if you want to have people use less polluting energy, be it in their homes or their cars, and you want to use a pricing instrument, you will have a regressive impact on the most vulnerable, because that will increase prices of things that are necessary for a good standard of living. And this is a policy mix problem. And we've made sure in all our policy proposals that we have protective measures for the most vulnerable and equity measures as well. All in all, there is a fear of change, of disruption, and the policy package is trying to address all the concerns, but also paint a picture of a future that is appealing to everyone. social concerns in the European Union are very well funded, and we have to, yes, have a policy package that is socially informed, but also have a policy package that takes this opportunity of this great civilizational change to bring people up. We have in the EU some of the highest GDPs per capita in the world. That's Luxembourg, Denmark, Ireland, the Netherlands, Austria, Sweden, or Germany. But we have an unemployment problem. Our employment rate is only 72%. And we have not very good statistics on the number of social fronts. For example, people at risk of poverty or exclusion as 21% of the population. The way we calculate that is those people whose income is less than 60% of the median income. People in energy poverty, around 11%, 50 million people. These are people that are that cannot afford to have a warm home or use more than twice the median share of revenue for energy, or are late in paying for their utility bills. We have around 5% severely materially deprived people. So we have a list of deprivation items. So if you don't have a phone, if you're not able to eat a nutritional meal every day, you enter into that category. And we have 4% people in severe housing deprivation. This indicator is about having leaky roofs, damp walls, having rot, not having a bath or shower in the building, etc. So back in 2021, when we designed our recovery package and our green stimulus package, we decided on new targets to reach by 2030. That is to have 15 million less people in being at risk of poverty and have at least 78% of adults in employment. I've put here the maps, not for you to, because they're very small, just for you to also have the idea that it's the situation in the European Union is quite heterogeneous. And so we have policy mechanisms that address both inequalities between different member states, but also within countries, between regions, etc. So we tabled the Green Deal vision back in December 2019. That gave us around 18 months of great debates about policy mechanisms. And many of these debates were about the social aspects. And that led us to have some sort of terms of reference, agreed terms of reference for what we needed to do. That is to try to reconcile the tragedy of the commons with the tragedy of Horizon, under strong time constraint in a democracy, of course, without leaving anyone behind. And we very much feel that because we're the first in the world having that kind of ambition and tabled that policy package, we are actually trying to develop a proof of concept for other jurisdictions to look at and to maybe inspire themselves of in the next months and years. The vision that has been used is that of the EU's Man on the Moon movement. These were the words of our president, so Ursula von der Leyen. You see her picture here. And we've also costed, the European Investment Bank costed, how much decarbonizing the EU would cost compared to what it's put to put man on the moon. And it's about 18 times. For decarbonizing the planet, it's about 459 times. Seems like a lot, but in fact, we've seen with the pandemic that the strong recovery and stimulus package worldwide, when there is an emergency, often finance can be found. What we have set in stone already, and the first bullet does address some of the horizon problems I mentioned before. We have a constitutional type of climate law, a bit like New Zealand and your Net Zero Act. This ours asks us to go to net zero in 2050 and go net negative afterwards. Our law, our climate law, also asks us to have, not only at national level within the EU, but also a sub-national level, reconciled vision of where we want to go with energy and with other emission sectors across a rolling decade that has to be updated regularly, and within a 30-year plan. So these discussions that are taking place at regional level and at national level ensure that political parties and actors, civil society discusses these settings beyond one electoral cycle. We also have tabled a sustainable corporate reporting legislation which changes the way businesses have to consider their impact on the environment and their strategies to bring their company towards net zero. They have to now report on that in their financial report. So it has to be discussed at the board level into companies in the European Union. We're also looking at tabling in the second half of this year, that is soon now, in September, October, a new sustainable corporate governance legislation that would change the fiduciary duties of company directors so that they are trained with regard to net zero, so that they put at the core of their strategies how their company will thrive in a net zero world. Our goal, our stringent goal, has also some interesting design to ensure that we keep within the time frame, because it's pretty stringent internationally. It's not only the minus 35% that is stringent, it's the details of its definition. For example, it's a domestic goal, so we're not planning on buying any offshore emissions reductions. All emissions reductions have to take place on EU territory, so we're not depending on others being ready to sell us emissions reductions or things like that. It's all in our hands. We're also not planning on using too much. We are still going to use a bit, not too much sinks, nature sinks. So forestry, removal of CO2 from the atmosphere through the planting of forests. We don't want to incentivize this too much, because that's in a way can be a free out of jail card for some of our emitters, and we want our emitters to focus on decreasing our emissions rather than focusing on offsetting their emissions. And that policy setting increases the pressure to decarbonize now. We also have set a package quite ambitious from the financial point of view as part of our COVID recovery, because we set aside around 5 trillion New Zealand dollars at EU level to incentivize investments and to accompany the transition. And that is on top of what our member states with their own budgets and their own banks have set aside. Now we'll present our basket of measures, and don't be frightened, there are a lot. We table 13 pieces of legislation on the 14th of July. However, there's only 5 new, and so for us it's not business as usual, it is transformational, but we're using the same type of tools, we're just tightening them further. What I'll explain now is the architecture, and then I'll go into each measure. So the architecture is that we have pricing tools. It is the polluter pays principles. We have that as a constitutional principle, it's in our treaty, and there's not much to say about it. You also have pricing mechanisms in New Zealand. The second pillar is a target pillar. So we use targets on top of pricing mechanisms for several reasons. Typically, there are limits to what market mechanisms, what pricing can bring, because there are non-market barriers to emissions reduction. A well-known one is the split incentive that you have between the owner and the renter of a building in terms of who invests in energy efficiency improvements, because of course it's the renter that will see the impact on his or her energy bills and not the owner. So there are not market barriers. So the targets are useful for that. We're also using targets to deliver on other policy outcomes than climate, and in particular to create jobs. So our energy efficiency targets in particular are very rich in job creation, and that creates a type of jobs that we need in the European Union. And similarly, our renewable energy directive creates new types of industrial jobs, new source of industrial competitiveness. And yeah, another reason why we have targets. The third type of legislation that we have is around rules. And it is to squarely explain to the business sector what we're expecting from them. Clear signal, for example, with our revised legislation on CO2 emissions from cars and vans, we've said we don't want any new internal combustion engine car or van be put on the European roads after 2035. 2035 is the ban date, the cutoff date. So the EU automotive industry and also automotive industry worldwide interested in importing cars into the EU, exporting cars to the EU, have now this very clear and 15 years ahead for them to be able to prepare for that. We finally have a foundation of funds in our policy suite. And that is, these funds are fed with revenues from pricing. I will now go through each of our policy proposals and explain what are the equity settings within these. Our EU ETS, for example, the revenues from our ETS, 2% of them go into a modernization fund that you can see at the bottom. This modernization fund is open for the member states that have the 12 lowest GDPs, GDP per capita in the European Union. These member states can use these funds to modernize their energy system, to invest in energy efficiency, to invest in renewable energy, to retrain their workers. In the EU ETS, we're also stopping the free pass that we were giving to our industries on paying for their pollution if they were trade exposed. We were giving free allocation to our industry, New Zealand does too, because the worry was that if we submitted our industry to the full cost of their pollution, then basically that pollution would move abroad together with the jobs. And that would be a lose-lose-lose outcome, because then emissions reductions wouldn't happen. And we would develop the technologies that we need to decrease emissions, and the price of these technologies would not decrease. So that the policy setting until now was, well, then we need to give a free pass to our industry. We want to stop that, but we don't want to lose the jobs, and we don't want the emissions to just be sent to leak, because that's the word that is used. We don't want these emissions to leak abroad. That's why we're setting up the carbon border adjustment mechanism that you see at the bottom of this pillar. This adjustment mechanism will cover 6 industrial products: steel, iron, aluminium, fertilizer, cement, and electricity. And importers of these products into the EU will be subject to an adjustment of the price to make sure that they pay for the carbon that is included in their products in the same way as the European industry is paying. That will ensure that we keep the industrial jobs in the European Union, and that we give a fair chance for steel workers, for cement workers, to transition in the European Union towards greener steel or clean or greener cements, so that we develop the technologies as well. The second proposal under pricing is this new, very controversial, separate emissions trading system that we're creating here. We are creating a dedicated, standalone emissions trading system for the fuel suppliers, for road transport, and the fuel suppliers for heating our homes. We are doing that because, yes, we have rules for what should be the design of new cars, and we have rules for what should be the design of new houses, but we have a huge stock problem that we need to clean in the next decade. And so we need to accelerate the replacement rate of cars and vans, and accelerate the refurbishments, the renovation of buildings above the natural rates of renovations, because the natural rate of renovation of a building in the European Union is 1% of the buildings per year. And 80% of the buildings that will stand in 2050, when we need to be at net zero, they already stand today. So we can not only count on our new legislation for the design of new buildings, we have to accelerate that rate. And we do so through this new pricing system. It is very controversial because it will increase fuel price for heating your home and for using your car. As long as you have not transitioned to a low carbon car or a low carbon home, you will see price increases. And of course, that can be extremely socially hurtful for the most vulnerable. That's why we are creating this new social climate fund that you see at the bottom here. And that social climate fund will be fed through revenues from the new ETS, but it will also start operating 1 year ahead. So how does it work? Well, we have smart accounting tricks where we will use budgets the first year and then reimburse ourselves with the revenues from the second year. What this social climate fund will do is that it will target support to the energy poor today in the European Union and the mobility poor and the micro enterprises, so that they are helped to leapfrog ahead of the price increase, or are helped with direct income support at the same time of the price increase. So what this will do is try to leapfrog the most vulnerable the quickest. Our member states have to send us plans as soon as possible, explaining how they are identifying these people in energy poverty. Well, we actually already know because we have set up an observatory on energy poverty a couple of years ago, but we're not entirely sure on who is mobility poor in the European Union. So we have to do that job and identify people and provide solutions so that they leapfrog. Some of the solutions are basically, a subsidy to leapfrog, or a zero interest rate loan, or if you're in this social housing, then the state will fund the energy efficiency upgrades. There's all sorts of possibilities. There will be more than 144 billion euros in that fund. And the idea is that no one that's in the most vulnerable part of the population will suffer from this new ETS. We have then another pricing system, which is our energy taxation directive. We are removing exemptions. So we're removing fossil fuel subsidies because we had exemptions for aviation, for shipping, for fishing, and also we had a lower rate for agricultural uses of fuel. We're stopping all of these exemptions and increasing all rates, but we're also letting our member states free to exempt the most vulnerable. Now, going to targets, the two first legislation are an internal way for us to distribute the effort inside the European Union, and we use GDP per capita as the repartition key for the effort. So no need to go into the details, but this is how we make sure that Bulgaria doesn't have to have the same efforts than Germany or the Scandinavian member states do. The revised energy efficiency legislation is interesting because it sets an absolute amount of energy to be used in the European Union each year, and that's decreasing. So we want to change the business model of energy distributors so that they don't make profits out of selling more energy, but profits out of selling energy services so that people become more energy efficient. We have these energy performance contract, for example, where a big building with lots of apartments, in particular if it's a social housing, then the owner would say to that energy service company, can you please provide me with that energy service in terms of lighting, number of appliances running, in terms of thermal comfort, both in winter and in summer, and I will pay you that fixed amount each month. And then the energy service provider has to invest in energy efficiency and make money, make profit out of that building using less energy. Under that directive, we're also asking our member states to renovate 3% of their publicly owned buildings each year. That will ensure that taxpayers' money used for heating or cooling buildings is not spent anymore on running costs of fuel, but in investments towards buildings that will not use that amount of energy in the future, and if possible, no energy at all. And that also has the advantage of making sure we have the businesses, the tradies, everyone ready and with upgraded skills, and the supply chains able to carry out accelerated renovations of the European building stock beyond the public sector. We have upgraded our renewable energy directive that sets targets for increasing renewables in sectors where there should be more, but it's not working at the moment. For example, in buildings, it would be quite easy to make sure that people use new buildings and also existing buildings are fitted with heat pumps and with solar panels, with all type of biomass burners. And so we want to reach 50% of energy used in buildings from renewables by 2030. That will create a pipeline of projects throughout the European Union, and will create jobs in the renewable energy sector, and will help the deployment. There's several other parameters, but I'll stop here. On the rules, I've already talked about the CO2 standards, so I'll talk about the infrastructure, the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Directive. This is to tackle range anxiety. Some people don't invest in electric vehicles or hydrogen trucks because they're worried about not being able to refuel or recharge. And there's also an urban-rural divide with regard to alternative fuel infrastructure. Our legislation sets rules that would apply across the European Union roads, main roads and cities, so that we have a number of publicly available charging spots, both for electricity and for hydrogen. It's every 60 kilometers on European roads and in all main cities, and every 150 kilometers for hydrogen and in all main European cities. Actually, for trucks with hydrogen, because we will need them more in delivery systems, it will also be in every 100 Ks and in every even smaller cities. I won't talk too much about our sustainable fuel blending system in aviation and maritime, because the vulnerable people typically don't really take the plane that much. And our funds. So Innovation Fund is fed in from revenues from our EU ETS, and it is for industrial sectors that are faced with problem with the transition to bid into to develop these low carbon technologies. I've talked about the Modernization Fund, the new Social Fund. I'll talk about the Just Transition Fund. That fund is for regions in the European Union that are either heavily invested in coal or into other polluting activities. And they can benefit for up this 20 billion euro pot here to do cheap finance for companies wanting to transition to something else, for incubators for startups, for public authorities in these regions to try to change the business model of the region, and for also lots of finance for retraining. The we think there's an overall positive effect. That's what our modeling shows, and that's what we've been trying to really achieve. Around 2 million jobs, additional green jobs can be created by 2050, 1 million in the first decade. And these are middle skills, middle paying jobs in construction, manufacturing and services, the type of jobs that we need. And there's a potential to leave everyone out, because we would go towards a high running cost system where you buy fuel all the time, to a low running cost system. The wind or the sun doesn't send a bill. There's high upfront investment costs, but then the running costs are lower. We would also, in particular in cities, disconnect consumption from ownership. Typically a car stands idle over 90% of the time. It's not a good way of immobilizing your capital. And with smart digitalization of transport, sharing cars, but also sharing all sorts of other commodities would be easier through the transformation of consumption through services rather than through ownership. And then there would be better health outcome for all, from cleaner air, water, and thermal comfort in homes. In the European Union, thermal comfort is more and more understood as cooling rather than heating. Though actually in 2019, the climate disaster that created the most death was the European heat wave. And the deaths were not in Southern Europe, they were in Germany and in Belgium, in those countries where there's no culture of dealing with heat waves. So to conclude, our leaving no one behind package is really to ensure that the transition is just, because otherwise there will just be no transition. And this is a sentence that is often used by our vice president that is tasked with the European Green Deal. He says there will just be social unrest. And it is the spectre of the yellow vest movement that some of you will, many of you, I hope, remember, when happened in France, when the French government tried to increase taxes on road fuels and was faced with strong discontent from people that felt they were left without a real alternative. So far, the EU has developed the proof of concept for climate policy because we've decoupled growth and emissions. We've actually already reduced our emissions by over 23%, and we grew our economy by over 60%. So we are kind of the poster child for climate action on that angle. But the next frontier for us is to decouple our net zero policies from adverse distributional and social impacts, and more than that, use the opportunity to reduce inequalities. That's increased ambition in the next decade has to be accompanied by increased solidarity and increased redistribution systems. It's not between generations, but it's also between nations, regions, and between rural and urban areas. And so we're really making this a priority throughout our policy design. And we believe this experience that we are now engaging in, and I know our member states and our parliaments will now start discussing what we've tabled, is really interesting beyond the European Union, because it's a high stake example for everyone, whether the climate pioneer, climate action pioneer, the European Union manages this. We have in our policy setting, in our climate law, something quite interesting that says, if what we have tabled in the end is watered down through the adoption process, the legislative process, the European Commission has to immediately propose something else to bridge the gap. So we are quite, as we table our legislation, we also say to our the parliaments and our member states, you may not agree with that, but then the onus is on you to come up with something that is just as ambitious, because there's no way out of building a better world and acting in sync with the climate emergency in this decade. I have talked enough now, so I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll stop sharing as well.
Thank you. I can't speak.
We can hear you.
Can you hear me? Oh, well, that's
Yeah.
fine. Don't need to see me then. Thank you very much, Caroline. I was impressed when we first met to talk about this, about your enthusiasm and your deep concern for these issues. What comes out in your speech that I really like is, over the period of time recently, we've all had to experience the impact of leadership in terms of things like COVID, where we can see the disparity between people with good, strong leadership and countries where they've got much weaker leadership. And it seems to me that when you've got strong leadership, you've got to have a strategy to achieve something. You've got to be able to explain it well. You've got to take people with you. And you've also got to try and address their concerns, as well as focusing on where people will miss out. And I think that it's quite interesting that the European Union are trying to achieve all of these things, and it's quite impressive. I think it's very ambitious, and I think that we'll all be watching with great intensity to see whether you can actually achieve it with all of us. So I will now pass over to Philip Tremewen, who's going to introduce Julianne Genter. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, thanks, Patricia. I'm Philip Tremewen. I'm delighted to welcome Julianne Genter to tonight's session. Julianne was Minister for Women and Associate Minister of Health and of Transport from 2017 to 2020. Currently, she holds a whole bunch of portfolios for the Green Party, including local government, infrastructure, energy, and resources. Welcome, Julianne, and over to you to respond to what we've heard from Caroline about the EU's Green Deal. Kia ora.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. I think the host of this meeting needs to allow me. There we go. Start my video so I can see you all. Thank you so much for that introduction, Philip, and thanks to the Fabian Society for inviting me to speak at this. Caroline, I just have to say that what an incredibly comprehensive presentation. It was really fascinating, and I found it really, really useful. I think just to start with, I would say there's no question the maths of what we need to achieve to have a realistic chance of staying under 1.5 are incredibly confronting. And I don't believe this is an issue that I hear spoken about enough in mainstream media, and particularly in Aotearoa. Even the government, with a huge focus on climate change and the urgency of it, I don't think has brought up the fact that we really only have 6 years to make significant reductions in emissions to have a good chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. Of course, the New Zealand government is probably starting a little bit late compared to the EU. I would say the EU is definitely ahead of us in terms of confronting climate change and implementing the policies that we need to. That was really clear. I think you talked about the EU's contribution to global emissions, and I would say per capita, the EU's emissions are almost certainly lower than New Zealand's. We had a decade of complete inaction before we had a government that then brought in the Zero Carbon Act. And now we have government departments in the process of developing emissions reduction plans in a really short timeframe. So I think that what we bring to Glasgow, unfortunately, at the end of the year, won't be as comprehensive and possibly not as ambitious as what the EU has proposed to do with their Green New Deal. I think identifying the challenge of equity at the same time as emissions reductions is really, really important. And from the policy proposals that you put forward, it seems to be very advanced and really has a good chance of achieving what the EU wants to achieve. And I know that we're very conscious of that in New Zealand as well, that we need to have effective policies to reduce emissions, and we also need to have effective policies to deal with inequality in order to ensure that the most vulnerable aren't worse off because of these policies. I have read some criticism of even the EU Green New Deal not being sufficient in this respect, and that even the focus on net zero, which I think comes out of the Paris Agreement, and was certainly a safer place to start. There are some concerns being raised by scientists and others about whether net zero is really the right measure and whether that will be sufficient for us to achieve the limits to global warming that the world is setting out to achieve. And I mean, that'll be a question for our government as well. I thought it was really interesting that in the EU Green New Deal, there's less reliance or no reliance on purchasing credits from offshore, and that there's a reduced reliance on natural sinks. I think that New Zealand for a very long time, since the Kyoto Protocol, has relied to some extent on purchasing credits from offshore. We did luckily make a policy change where we stopped accepting some of the really dodgy ones. But in order to maintain a level of ambition that we want to, we might simply not physically be able to make the reductions that we want to in the short term. And so it's a question about whether we reduce our ambition and not buy offshore credits, or whether we, I think that's quite a difficult situation. From the Green Party's perspective, I would say, obviously, we want to have emissions reductions here in New Zealand. We should have started 15, 20 years ago to be in a position to do that. And in our first carbon budget period, it might be very difficult for us to do that because there was no action for such a long time. But then on the other hand, COVID has shown that we can make drastic changes when we set our mind to it. And climate change surely is just as big a threat, if not bigger, than COVID. And so it does require massive transformation of our society. And that's the discussion that we need to be having. I did have a question, and I'll just put a couple of questions that maybe you can address at the end of me talking. One is about the non-reliance on natural sinks, because obviously we do need to make drastic real emissions cuts, but we also do need to incentivize those natural sinks. That is part of the solution. So I'm interested to know if there are additional policies for that. They're just dealt with outside the ETS. Because I think that forests and other natural sinks are something that we're going to have to lean on quite heavily, both, and if it's done well, can be good for biodiversity as well. Of course, if it's not done well, could make things worse. And I say this in New Zealand, where there's a huge reliance on Pinus radiata to be a natural sink and offset emissions. And that is probably not great from a biodiversity point of view, or really a carbon reduction point of view either here in New Zealand. The other thing that I thought was really fantastic is to see the introduction of the carbon border adjustment. I think that's really, really important. And I did wonder if, the statement at the end of your presentation about how the growth of the economy has been decoupled from carbon emissions. You've managed to reduce carbon emissions, but grow the economy. I do wonder if that is fairly taking into account a certain externalization of production to poorer countries, that, we're giving more time to reduce their emissions. But from a global perspective, it's simply not sustainable for rich countries like New Zealand and the EU to say, oh, yes, we've reduced our emissions, but really we're just importing more stuff that's been produced overseas. So I think that the carbon border adjustment stuff will help with that. It doesn't cover all products, but it's very, very interesting, because here in New Zealand, there's a line that says, oh, well, it's okay, our emissions are higher per capita. That's okay because we're producing food for the world. But if we don't think that we should be counted for the emissions, our production of agricultural emissions, because that food is being exported, then we probably should be counted for all the manufactured goods that we are importing that are being manufactured in other countries that are therefore higher emissions. So I think that this, the country basis, and of course the EU's it's not just one country, it's 27 countries. And so it's a great opportunity to integrate and take a more holistic view. But that country basis for calculating emissions and making plans to reduce it could be a problem, or could be a barrier to us globally achieving what we want to achieve, if we don't have a sufficient sense of the whole world, what's happening with emissions, where is the production, what are the transport needs required, how do we achieve a good standard of living for all humans, which should be possible, and a safe climate and a safe natural environment, and stop the biodiversity loss and the extinction event the mass extinction event, which is currently happening. The detailed policy changes, to me, all look right in line with what I would think would make perfect sense. Retrofitting buildings, changing electricity sources, the transport stuff. I actually think most of the EU's further ahead than New Zealand. It's interesting that 2035 has been chosen as the date for no new fossil fuel vehicles. That seems a little bit late to me. I think we don't have an end date to importing new fossil fuel vehicles, but I think probably 2030 would be the right date. Some European countries have an earlier date and are further ahead in that sense. I see urban form and transport as really instrumental to how New Zealand addresses its various challenges, including reducing carbon emissions, getting better outcomes for public health, for the natural environment, for air quality, and even addressing some of our issues around housing affordability. All of that can be done if we support denser development within our existing urban area, And we can learn a lot of lessons from many European cities in that respect, how that can be done well to provide quality of life for the residents of the city, affordable housing options that are close to shops and jobs, education, and amenities like parks and playgrounds or early childhood education centers, and ensuring that real sustainable transport within an urban area, even freight within the urban area for the last few miles is now moving to cargo bikes, electric cargo bikes in many cities, and it's proving to be more efficient and less costly. So there's a real strong economic argument for it, as well as carbon reduction benefits and road safety benefits, amenity of the city benefits. But here in New Zealand, we're so far away from that. And because we're so far away from Europe, I think it's difficult for many people to imagine how our towns and cities could actually deliver higher quality of life and lower emissions in this respect. And the policy changes that we need to make in transport and urban planning to achieve those different outcomes are pretty substantial. And that's where I really found it fascinating what you were talking about, the research about how there's a disconnect between people agreeing that something should be done about climate change and that the EU should make reductions to carbon emissions, that there's really strong support for that. But once you get down to the nitty gritty of the policy changes that affect people's lives, there isn't as much consensus and people are less likely to agree. I haven't seen any similar research here in New Zealand. I'm sure it exists. I suspect we're not at over 90% agreement about a need to take action on climate change, but it certainly is coming up as a much bigger issue for people. But I wouldn't say that it would be as high as what it is in Europe, and that's really fantastic to see. But definitely that disconnect between support for action on climate change and, say, affordable housing, and then a disconnect between the actual policy changes that we need to make to achieve that is the same here in New Zealand. And so I'm sure we need to do the same sort of storytelling to help people understand not only why we must act on climate change, but why these specific policies are important, how they can, benefit people. And it does mean things will change, and not everyone might be happy with that change, but ultimately, one thing that I didn't hear you mention, but I think is probably really important, and maybe I should finish off with that because I've been talking for a while now, is the importance of democratic institutions and the design of our electoral systems or our consultation processes at a local level, at a regional level, at central government level, to ensure that people are really well represented and able to participate well in these solutions. My impression is that some European countries are particularly good at this, and that those ones tend to be further along on both climate action and reduced inequality. Now, that could be wrong. This is just a high-level observation. But in New Zealand, local government is not particularly well funded by central government. It's not all local government has proportional representation electoral systems. So we don't have MMP at a local government level. We don't have STV everywhere. We don't have very large numbers of local government representatives. And I suspect that that's something that could also help us achieve the policy implementation that's needed to reduce emissions, simply by making sure that everybody's voice is heard well and is able to participate in the solution seems like a better way to achieve them rather than reducing democratic input into that. And I think I had one more. Yeah, the final question, is just whether it will be enough. And obviously, I think the EU Green New Deal is further along from where I would like to see Aotearoa New Zealand and where the Green Party thinks that we should be. But there's still that question, is even that sufficient for us to achieve 1.5 degrees and staying below that? But it certainly is inspirational, and it's great to see how comprehensive it is. And it will be really interesting to see what happens in Glasgow.
Kia ora. Thank you, Julianne. Caroline, do you want to respond perhaps to that issue that Julianne raised about electoral systems and people's participation in the decisions? just to start with. We'll go to the questions in the chat in a minute.
Thanks, Philip. Yes, I have Julianne actually had several questions, but I agree. So having people's assemblies on climate is and a bottom-up democratic process to design what should be a country strategy on climate action has been done in Ireland and in France and maybe in other member states, but these are the two countries that I've read the most about. And I know mostly about the French outcome. It's sobering because the participants into the People's Assembly on Climate that has been created in France really had put a long list of proposals for the Assembly, so for Parliament to consider and for the government to consider. And it has been difficult for the government and for the legislature to actually legislate that for all sorts of fear of disruption issues. Some of the proposals were not, maybe well designed or well costed, but some, got bogged down with this horizon problem that there is with regard to taking strong action now and still winning the next election, and that is a problem in every country worldwide. And these assemblies, they help in particular because suddenly for people in the streets, they feel less, they feel more linked to the issue if there is a People's Assembly. So it's good for awareness about the issues in the countries, both in France and in Ireland, as well in Finland. There was also a process in Finland. Awareness about climate issues and climate science is amongst the highest in the European Union. And I think it's also, linked to the fact that they had, all these countries had this process, democratic bottom-up process into deciding, what should be the measures for us to go to net zero. Philip, I'll just say a few words about some of the questions that Julianne had on natural sinks in particular. Yes, our sink decreases in the European Union, so we have to regenerate our forests. And so we have an aside policy on regenerating our sink, but it's not used for us to meet our target. Yes, a little bit is used, 310 million tonnes by 2030, but our ambitions for our sink are broader than just meeting our target. And there are Chinese walls, I would say, in between emissions reductions and increasing our sink. Carbon border adjustment, and the problem between consumption and production of emissions is about having a trade rules system that works for climate. And there are discussions at the WTO, and often they take a long time. That's why the European Union decided to go ahead with our border adjustment mechanism, and we believe it's WTO compatible, of course. And there's other settings that we are testing so that we take responsibility for our consumption in the European Union. And I can't go through all the tools, but there are some policy tools that you can do to ensure that there would be the carbon footprint of products that enter into your market is either limited or transparent so that people can make the right choices. The 2035 for vehicles, some people think it's too late. Some people think it's too early. It depends what's your link with the automotive industry. But the logic is cars stay 15 years on European roads. So if we have to go to net zero in 2050, the last ones have to be put on European roads in 2035. So that's the easy logic behind the date. The urban form, yes. Well, do we have similar issues? Yeah, I think I've answered most of the questions now. Over to you, Philip.
Oh, thanks very much, Caroline. I'll pass now to Andre and Mike, and they'll feed in questions from the chat. Andre.
Yes, thank you very much. I might paraphrase some of the questions, and I won't mention every question, give a name, but I'll try to do my best to cover as many topics as possible. So the first one I'll do from Gray Southern, which is, this is very impressive, with a clear target of zero emissions on 2050. With the uncertainty in science and behavior of other nations, how can you be sure that this is early enough?
That 2050 is early enough, yes. We can't be sure. Actually, for developed countries, it'd be better to go towards net zero before 2050. Our legislation in the European Union asks us to go to net zero in 2050. However, we have possible overachievement that's baked in, because the European system is a minimum threshold, and then our member states have to deliver on that minimum emissions delivery that's set by the EU, but then they can be more ambitious, and some of our member states always set national settings that are beyond the EU, and that's why we always overachieve. We also have this rule that we will upgrade our target every 5 years, and it could well be that if things go well and our member states help us overachieve, well, then we tighten the goal. We'll see.
In terms of Central and Eastern Europe, how will the EU help remove Poland's coal dependency, and along with ensuring Poland, Hungary and Bulgaria, etc., stick to these impressive but demanding policies?
We've had experience now, because we've been legislating common EU targets with national targets for over close to 20 years. And the way it works is that we oil the discussions with support. So we have a budget in the European Union that is a redistribution budget, and we're not simply asking our member states to deliver, we also provide support for delivery. And Poland has received, I think, the most support of all member states with regard to emissions reduction. And that helps Poland plan a transition and a thriving economy with less reliance on coal. And so our EU system is some sort of mini multilateral system whereby we negotiate tools that overall satisfy everybody. There's a give and take, but in the end we deliver, and we have a legal regime that makes sure that our member states deliver, because if they don't, then we have courts, then we have fines. And it's always better to receive support than be fined.
For the Social Climate Fund, so if the purpose is to address inequality, but is it to support people to switch to a cleaner source of energy, or to enable them to keep using carbon-heavy sources without suffering financially?
No, so the support is a bridging support towards low carbon lifestyles, and the temporary income support will stop once people will have leapfrogged. So it's not to prolong the use of inefficient cars or being housed in energy inefficient buildings, is to ensure that during the transition, vulnerable people are not disadvantaged because of the price hike. However, all our other tools will ensure that there are investments made to eventually leapfrog, and with the vulnerable being leapfrogged them first, because they will be leapfrogged through public finance, mostly through the rest of our tools. For example, the Energy Efficiency Directive, which requires member states to deliver emissions reduction, energy efficiency improvements in the public sector, and to also target the most vulnerable as a priority.
For transport fuels, what is the EU goal for green hydrogen and other EV charging and hydrogen stations, public investments, or through directions on private petrol stations?
So we have a target of having 40 gigawatts of green hydrogen electrolyzer in the European Union by 2030. And the target for hydrogen is a mix within road fuels, and I believe is 2.6% by 2030. We need to check, but I think 2.6%. Yeah, 2.6%. The target is not. We anticipate that it will mostly be used by trucks rather than by cars, but we already have hydrogen fuel cars in the European Union, and technology neutral, whether that's the solution or whether electric power is the solution. Sorry, I think I didn't answer the whole of your question. It's because I didn't understand all of it.
So if it's, yeah, I think one was what's the distance between stations for charging stations for hydrogen?
150. So the target for 2030 is 150 kilometers between hydrogen stations for cars, but there should be one in every city. And for hydrogen stations for trucks, it's not exactly the same. They should be every 100 km on European roads and in every city.
And so if they're publicly owned charging stations or with private petrol stations?
I think member states may decide, as long as they're publicly accessible, we will not mandate a particular ownership system.
Okay, good. Is Europe also planning for degrowth just in case populations fall? Does that affect it?
No, Europe is not. There's a lively political debate. There's a lively academic debate about this, and we are not planning for degrowth.
And about agricultural emissions, which you'll know in New Zealand is quite a big deal. So how does the EU plan to reduce agricultural emissions? And in terms of barriers to introducing a border tax adjustment for methane intensive products entering the EU from abroad, are there plans or thoughts about entering having methane taxes for places like from New Zealand?
Okay, there's a lot in there. So agricultural emissions in the European Union, it's only 10% of our emissions, and we've already reduced them by 20% since 1990. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruits already done. We have reduced our number of cattle head, and we are using less fertilizers. So that's why our NOx and our methane emissions are going down. In this policy package, agriculture is part of the burden sharing, or let's say the effort sharing between our member states in terms of reducing emissions. So each of our member states is given a particular homework with regard to reducing their agriculture emissions in a bundle with the housing and waste. And so each member state will decide what makes sense for them in terms of how the effort should be geared towards agriculture versus waste versus buildings. However, we also have a common goal. That is, in 2035, we want to achieve climate neutrality in the land sector and the agricultural sector combined. And it's also linked to the sinks. So for 2030, we want to grow our sink as a separate pillar. So nature, forest and nature as a separate pillar, to grow our sink to around 310 million tons. In 2030, we want to put agriculture in that pillar and ensure 5 years later, in 2035, climate neutrality over agriculture and land use. And so that is a goal for all of the European Union. And we also have common policies on agriculture. You've heard of the common agricultural policy, and targets such as less land in production, less use of fertilizers, more organic. So there are all rules, lists of targets that farmers have to deliver on in the European Union in the next 5 years. All of that will continue to drive emissions reductions down in the EU for agriculture. What we're not planning, however, is to have a single EU price on agricultural emissions, because food, so our economy is too heterogeneous for us to have a single price on agricultural emissions. Standard of livings are very different in Scandinavia than they are in, let's say, in Romania or Bulgaria, and you can't have one price. That would, the distributional effect in the EU would it just wouldn't work. And so that's why we will not submit agricultural imports into the EU into a CBAM, a border adjustment mechanism, because the whole idea of a border adjustment mechanism is that you have an internal carbon price in the EU. However, we are working under a policy called Farm to Fork on a holistic view of what needs to be done with our land. And it's not only focused on climate. We need to have a collective discussion of what we want our land to give us in terms of ecosystem services. We need to produce food. We need room for biodiversity. We need to produce energy. We need sinks. We want to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So we have a scarcity of land, and we have to decide what is the best use of land for what purpose. And it could be, that's a very methane efficient way of farming livestock is actually not efficient for water or for biodiversity, for all sorts of issues. So we want to have a holistic view of the use of land and of the impact of farming that goes well beyond the climate problem. We also have a potential food security problem in the world, but including in the European Union, with the dire impacts, climate impacts on food growing regions. And so we have to keep taking into account that the world is changing rapidly, and we need to adjust our expectations at what land can provide us with.
Now, in terms of helping other countries outside of the EU, so how willing is the EU to share their process and their technology and their money to other countries?
So we are proud to say we're the first climate finance donor in the world. The developed world has this goal of collectively mobilizing $100 billion a year for the developing world. And we're around $85 billion altogether. So we are not delivering on our Paris Agreement at the moment. 26 billion of these dollars comes from the European Union. So we have overachieved compared to what our GDP would mean we would need to give. So yes, we're expecting other developed countries to make similar efforts as we've done on climate finance. We are also the first development finance donor internationally. And so we have completely mainstreamed the climate emergency in our development policy to ensure that we help developing countries also leapfrog to not only low carbon futures, but a resilient climate future. Adaptation is very important, particularly in Africa, which is our closest neighbor.
So we have a comment that, thank you for your fantastic presentation, Caroline. You mentioned leave no one behind. So in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals developed by the UN, how will the EU climate change policies be connected to the UN Sustainable Development Goals?
So it's SDG 13, and we are referencing all our metrics and our efforts. We are benchmarking against, not necessarily on adaptation though. We have to focus on adaptation a lot more, and we've seen the disasters in Europe over the European summer. And that's something that we are also prioritizing in our spending now, so that whenever we put something new on the landscape, that new building, that new asset, that new infrastructure actually is designed to withstand what's coming at us. And it's also, I understand, a priority for New Zealand next year. And it is something really happy, not only about adaptation, but we really want to exchange notes with jurisdictions worldwide and cooperate because if we're stronger together on this.
Andre, just before the next question, I'd like to ask Julianne if she's got any more thoughts in response to what Caroline's been saying.
Not really. I just think, Caroline, it's just very clear. And I guess the one question was around not planning for degrowth. I feel like this question is going to come up a lot more about, and I don't think it's necessarily an easy conversation to have, because people mean different things by economic growth, but it's pretty clear that some aspects of economic growth cannot continue. And I guess from your point of view, when you said we're not talking about degrowth, is that simply meaning that we wouldn't accept a reduction in standard of living, and we think that can be achieved while protecting the environment and the climate? Or is it more around expectations around population, etc.?
I think there's several angles to what I said. So we are shifting towards well-being types of measuring our success, so like New Zealand did. So that's a way in which we are setting ourselves different benchmarks than traditional ones with regard to economic success, well-being ones. However, in terms of degrowth, there is this necessity to actually produce these low carbon cars, these windmills, all these technologies that we need to go to net zero. So these are the transition emissions, and these are the transition growth. So in a sense, before we can even, I think, and I would say now, this is my point of view, not the EU's point of view. I think before we can talk seriously about degrowth, we need to talk about delivering all these technologies to 8 billion people first. And yes, there's a lot of things that we can do about our production and our consumption. And we have this strong circular economy thinking in the European Union that addresses some of it. But I just think that from a personal point of view, the discussion is a bit too premature in this critical decade. But it is an interesting discussion from the psychological settings point of view as to what we believe is expectations to have for one's life and what values we should have. That is this, clearly an interesting discussion. But there is no consensus at all in the European Union on degrowth, and I don't think we will see one quickly. There's no consensus in the academic world. It's going to take some time, and I'm not sure it's the right framing necessarily. And in terms of population, our population is decreasing, but we will see migratory pressure for sure. So it's very difficult to see where this is going. Thank you.
Okay, so the Fabian Society, we have quite a few economists and lots of discussions on fiscal policy, such as taking on debt to make improvements and various other fiscal measures. So is there fiscal policy plans to reduce or eliminate unemployment, along with accelerate climate action and help a just transition?
Sorry, I really didn't understand this one. I'm sorry.
Okay, so
our fiscal policy can decrease employment. Is that the question?
Well, the question has the three things of eliminate unemployment, accelerate climate action, and then we have the word just transition in New Zealand, which
we have that too. So what we've done with the green stimulus package is change the settings of our budget. So we are changing the goalposts with regard to how we use public money to ensure that whatever is done with public spending is either helping with the climate transition or at least doesn't harm. So we have this do no harm requirement on any public spending. That's valid for the European Union, but which we have also deployed for our member states spending as long as it is on co-funding things with us. So it is quite powerful because in some of our member states, we deliver 86% of the money for public procurement in these member states, in particular in Eastern Europe. And so we are significantly changing the way fiscal policy is done in the European Union with these new settings on public spending. We've also changed settings for private investments through ways that the New Zealand is also now developing, linked to a definition of what is a sustainable investment to avoid greenwashing, both in the private and in the public sector, so that we are not, yes, we are being genuinely helpful when we say we are spending for green outcomes. And that is called a taxonomy. It's a taxonomy. It's a definition of what can be considered green under different metrics. And we're very happy to see that New Zealand is interested and is looking at it also for its in particular for the private settings for banks and banking disclosures for the financial sector.
Thank you very much. Those are all of my questions.
Okay, so we've come to the end of the session, and I would really very much like to thank you, Caroline, for what's been an absolute tour de force in explaining the EU Green Deal and also bringing us into some sharp detail on all the massive range of significant questions that you're adopting. So that's been absolutely fantastic, and thank you for that. Thanks also, Julianne, for bringing our perspective from Aotearoa New Zealand in and sharpening up our debate here as well. That the Fabian Society motto is to incite debate. This issue is just so huge and so much debate, but so much. What's really encouraging about this is to see concrete action towards addressing some of the issues that do need to be sorted out. So thanks also to Pat and Philip and Andre, and from us at the Fabians, good night. And thank you very much to all of you who've joined the meeting. I hope you found it interesting. It will be up on the YouTube Fabian section on the website, so you can go back and look at it again or share it with others if you would like to. So good night, everybody, and stay safe.